There's a long list of liberal celebrities who swear they'll go if a Republican is elected, and no one ever does. Miley Cyrus once said, "I am moving if Trump is my president. I don't say things I don't mean." Here she is looking miserable, having to endure America at the Grammys last Sunday. I guess she flew back from Tajikistan. In 2016, Eddie Griffin said, "If Trump wins, I'm moving to Africa." Apparently very slowly, because in Trump's 4 years, he only got as far as Van Nuys. George Lopez once said that if Trump won, he won't have to worry about immigration. We'll all go back. George Lopez still here. And it doesn't look like the migrant traffic is going back. For all the...
Good morning. It's Saturday, Enemies of My Country Saturday, April the 6th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch, rules for radical conservatives, rules for retrogrades, rules for patriots, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, the 33 strategies of war, and the enemies of my country. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
When World War II was over, Uncle Sam said, "Boys, go home." No one had to twist my arm. I came back across the phone. Now things are in a mess again. The world is all agog. Old Joe Stalin in Moscow's eating too high on the hog. Mr. Stalin, you're eating too high on the hog. Mr. Stalin, quit feeding those lies to your mob. Now, Joe, you'd better change your way, or like Hitler, you will pay for eating too high on the hog. Joe's getting up in age, but to say he ain't so dumb. He knows all about ships and tanks and maybe atom bombs. If he keeps eating like he is, at his own discretion, one of these days he's gonna wake up with American indigestion. Mr. Stalin, you're eating too high on the hog. Mr. Stalin, quit feeding those lies to your mob. We know that you've got armies, and we know that they're big, but don't forget the ham is close to the tail end of the pig. Office boys, they came to the UN and made a lot of noise. They're only taking orders that come across from you, but your hammer and sickle just won't fit our red, white, and blue. Mr. Stalin, you're eating too high on the hog. Mr. Stalin, quit feeding those lies to your mob. Now listen, Joe, you know that you aren't used to eating meat. Act your age, be yourself, stick to Kremlin wheat. Mr. Stalin, you're eating too high on the hog. Mr. Stalin, quit feeding those lies to your mob. Now, we aren't hunting trouble, but we ain't never run. Let's all live and let live, Joe. Remember the rising sun? Quit eating too high on the hog.
Thank you. And now there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
Today, most of the debate on the cutting edge in macroeconomics would not call itself Keynesian or monetarist or any other label relating to a school of thought. The data are considered the ruling principle, and it is considered suspect to have too strong a loyalty to any particular model about the underlying structure of the economy. Tyler Cowen. Cowen may be saying this prescriptively as if it were a good thing, or he may be saying it descriptively, merely observing what has become the case in modern economic debate. But what it is must surely be called an abject disaster, where the arrogance of data dependency pretends to work from no ideological framework, no belief system, no intellectual commitments or assertions. Post-Enlightenment economics have seen numerous errors in thought, but those errors have largely had a label attached to them, making identification and avoidance all the easier. There is no more dangerous error in economics than one hiding behind the disingenuity of anonymous love of data.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now we pick up where we left off last week with rules for radical conservatives.
Rule number 2, become what you behold. David Mamet's screenplay for The Untouchables is one of the most oft-quoted scripts in Hollywood history, and for good reason. After all, it contains the clearest and most vivid explication of the now notorious Chicago way, which comes as Sean Connery, Jimmy Malone, the honest cop, and Kevin Costner, Elliot Ness, the uptight Fed, sit in a church pew. Costner desperately needs the veteran Malone's advice on how to get the man he's after, the notorious gangster Al Capone, who seems to hold all of Chicago in his malevolent, fearsome sway. In what follows, think of yourself, the average, timid, clueless conservative, as Costner, and me, the crazy brave truth-teller, as Connery. You said you want to get Capone. Do you really want to get him? Asked Connery. You see, what I'm saying is, what are you prepared to do? Anything within the law, Costner answers. To which Connery replies, if you open the can on these worms, you must be prepared to go all the way. Because they're not going to give up the fight until one of you is dead. Costner whines that he doesn't know how to do it. And then Connery delivers the most famous lines in the picture. They pull a knife, you pull a gun. He sends one of yours to the hospital, you send one of his to the morgue. That's the Chicago way. And that's how you get Capone. Time to man up, ladies. Time to realize that Mao was right all along, and that power really does flow from the barrel of a gun. Do you think the 13 colonies won their independence from Britain by sitting down and negotiating their grievances over cucumber sandwiches? That's what we'd like you to think. As we've been busily disarming you, both physically in the form of our blatantly unconstitutional gun laws, and intellectually through the medium of political correctness, we've been busy burnishing our arsenals, sharpening our spears, and looking forward to the day when you're too weak to oppose us. And we, as the card-carrying cowards we are, no longer need fear that you'll do anything as rash as, fight back. But there's another line in the movie, even more applicable to our purposes here, which I want you all to commit to memory right now. It belongs to Ness and comes near the end of the film when Ness realizes that in order to get Capone, he's had to compromise every moral position he once held, and to become as ruthless and amoral as his adversary. I have forsworn myself. I have broken every law I have sworn to uphold. I have become what I beheld, and I am content that I have done right. And that, boys and girls, is how you get Capone. Therefore, and for however long it takes, become what you behold. Because unless you lose your fastidiousness and are prepared to get down in the trenches with us, your opponents, you're going to lose. Because if your enemy really is the liberal, progressive, socialist, communist, Marxist, fascist axis of evil that has so long bedeviled you, it's long past time that you put aside your nice Nancy boy ways and come out swinging. Because whereas you see politics as a necessary evil, we see it as a combination of our life's work and a blood sport, the thing that makes our day jobs worthwhile, even if, as in most cases with us, our day jobs are also the things that provide us with the wherewithal to screw you. After all, who's paying our public sector salaries? Suckers. And yet, time and again, what we hear from your side is that you wouldn't want to adopt our tactics, that you wouldn't want to lower yourself to our standards and principles. Your first mistake, since we don't have any, other than holding you to yours, that you would rather be right than win if it means fighting as dirty as we do. To which I say, that's why you're losers. How to talk like a liberal. And you must. As I've noted, if you guys are going to be able to fight us effectively, you have to know not only the territory, like Professor Harold Hill in The Music Man, but the lingo as well. And I'm not just talking about words like swell and gee whiz and so's your old man. I'm talking about being able to pass for one of us until we've got our guard down, and then whammo. To that end, I've assembled a few handy phrases, which you're going to have to learn to deliver with a straight face, like Mr. Orange in Reservoir Dogs, practicing his cover story in front of the men's room mirror, with the requisite raised eyebrow and our patented lefty sneer trademark dropped in at key junctures. You're deep in enemy territory now, so pay attention. 1. You can't possibly mean that. This is our way of saying you're full of it, but it goes beyond simple disagreement. It means that whatever it was that you just said, it has put you beyond the pale of polite discussion. It also very likely means you're a racist, a bigot, a homophobe, and/or a practicing Roman Catholic, all of which are, among our crowd, grounds for instant expulsion from polite society. You can't possibly mean that means that whatever you just said has wounded us grievously, has challenged some fundamental core belief of our Weltanschauung, and struck at the very heart of the fantasy world we mostly live in. It may be something as complex as a point-by-point refutation of an inconvenient truth, the truth about which we most definitely do not want to hear, or a minor statement of personal or political belief, such as, I'm not really comfortable with the idea of gay marriage, or, I think we ought to cut taxes to encourage private investment, or, Michael Jackson really sucked. In short, just about anything you can say that goes against our herd-like instinct to always be on the politically correct side of every issue will elicit this rejoinder, which is why, when you hear one of us utter one of our usual ex-cathedra-like pronunciamentos, just respond with, you can't possibly mean that, and watch the fur fly.
And that was the first part of Chapter 21 from Rules for Radical Conservatives by David Kahane. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left.
Rule 35. Retrogrades will never be able to profitably wield divisive group politics. As the One Ring of Power from Tolkien's Middle-earth answers only to Sauron, divisive group politics, the system of political grievance-mongering and favoritism based on race, sex, protected class, can only deftly be wielded by wicked men, by radicals. Splintering and factionalizing men, turning brother against brother, is hateful connivance. Branding people indelibly with a prefabricated identity and de-individualizing them due to a singular attribute is an affront to human dignity. It's an affront to free will. Good men cannot, without losing their souls in the process, embrace such a disordered method. There's no such thing as a man that's wicked in only one respect, since gravely disordered conduct, in a particular instance, is a mere symptom of a more fundamental problem with the will. For whoever keeps the whole law and yet stumbles at just one point is guilty of breaking all of it. James 2:10. So by definition, the retrograde has no recourse to divisive group politics. The minute he attempts to wield them, he ceases to be a retrograde, just like men who die wearing one of the rings forged by Sauron cease to be men and become wraiths. Application bears out the foolishness of any retrograde dalliances with divisive group politics. First of all, impelled as retrogrades are to refrain from doing evil so that good may come of it, they will always be at comparative disadvantage with wicked men who are willing to employ unscrupulous political stratagems in furtherance of crooked ends. So, even in the event that the retrograde takes leave of his senses to the point where he contemplates exploring the gloomy method of race, sex, protected class pandering, he will not be able to wield such politics to the fullest extent, his hand being stayed by his lingering sense of compunction. In other words, he will never be able to out-radical radicals. We'll never be able to pay a higher ransom for votes than they. Radicals are not hamstrung by ethics in their methods, the way retrogrades are. For radicals, the ends justify the means. Putting aside for now the tension of the following hypotheticals with constitutionalism, subsidiarity, and justice, let's suppose that the retrograde were, in an effort at ingratiation, to offer to black Americans reparations for the horrors of slavery. Radicals, being unmoored from moral concerns, would simply offer greater reparations. Supposing retrogrades offered a generous package of welfare benefits to illegal immigrants, radicals would simply offer more welfare benefits. Supposing retrogrades offered guaranteed paid maternity leave for working mothers, radicals would simply offer more paid leave. And if retrogrades should attempt to keep pace with radicals in their purchasing of allegiance, then we will have become, for all intents and purposes, indistinguishable from the very ideologues that we claim to oppose. We cannot afford to try to beat radicals at their own cynical game. To do so would mean forfeiting our souls and conceding the very principles that make our movement great. Neither may we have recourse to the twin swords of despair and envy, which play an integral role in advancing divisive group politics. The diabolical logic behind radicals' adherence to the politics of despair and envy is rather plain. We clearly live in a pluralistic society, one composed of numerous race, sex, protected class groups with varying interests. So, if radicals can convince a sufficient number of such groups that their interests are in conflict and competition with the interests of one collective bogeyman, i.e., the much maligned straight white male, then radicals can create an artificial cohesion between the various race, sex, protected class groups by mobilizing them against the bogeyman group. It's the old adage, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. If radicals can convince the race, sex, protected class groups that they're dedicated to serving the group's interests, then the groups will have been consolidated into a dependable radical voting bloc. If the membership in the groups eventually eclipses the membership in the bogeyman group, then radicals will forever hold the reins of power. This is why radicals want to flood the country with illegal aliens. It's why they're encouraging more people to come out of the closet as gay. It's why they're constantly telling blacks the lie that racism is still widespread. It's why they're against assimilation and aspirations for transracial national identity. It's why they're constantly telling women that retrogrades want to strip them of civil rights. They need to grow their coalition so that, in the aggregate, it becomes more numerous than the retrograde bloc. This is how radicals grow and mollify their base, at the expense of the unity and confraternity of the nation. In their lust for power, radicals need to divide the country so that they can vanquish the old order, represented in caricature by the straight white male. But retrogrades may not do this in reverse. We have too much honor. We are prohibited in conscience from drawing on the schadenfreude and resentment that the have-nots harbor for the haves. We are prohibited from stoking provincial inter-race and intersex rivalries in an attempt to benefit our political cause. We're prohibited from floating ourselves on the chests of drowning men. The retrograde may not incite his brothers against one another, attempting to build unity through division. We may not rob Peter to pay Paul in order to win hearts and minds. A faction bound together only by the hatred of a common enemy is dysfunctional to the core. While the pessimistic strategy of incitement does work to produce cheap political wins, it's why radicals use this method, the morally upright retrograde method is a juggernaut in its own right. Our strength lies in the fact that our worldview is the correct one, and in the fact that truth is on our side. The human intellect was made by God, so that men could come to know truth. The intellect, therefore, has a natural affinity for the truth. For mankind, truth is intrinsically attractive per se. Those opposed to truth have to use cheap gimmicks and deception of every stripe to attract followers, but not retrogrades. All we need is a platform from which to speak and ready ears and open hearts in our listeners. If retrogrades speak the truth boldly, never being cowed into silence, never allowing radicals to dictate what we can and can't say, we will win the culture and retain our honor in the process. In the end, tawdry gimmicks are no match for gritty substance.
And that was Rule 35, from Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left, by the Gordon brothers. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rules for Patriots by Steve Deese.
They obstruct because they're trying to stop what they don't. Unfortunately, it's not just the Republican Party establishment that violates this commandment, but sometimes conservatives as well. Take, for example, a man I really like. Rick Santorum's social conservative street cred is above reproach. For years, Santorum carried the water for social conservative causes and issues, earning the scorn of all the right people, like the liberal media and Republicrats like John McCain. Throughout the course of his underdog yet successful 2012 presidential campaign, he was the one candidate who most consistently defended America's Judeo-Christian moral tradition and effectively demonstrated the linkage between the growth of government and America's moral decline. So why did it take so long for Santorum to finally become the champion of this large block of values voters? Because a few years prior, Santorum abandoned his base by endorsing Arlen Specter, a rhino's rhino, over Pat Toomey in a hotly contested Pennsylvania Senate primary. In his next election, Santorum lost by 18 points, which remains one of the worst losses by an incumbent senator in American political history. When you throw in the fact Santorum wasn't saddled by a personal scandal, there is only one explanation for the magnitude of Santorum's defeat here. Some of his base stayed home, believing it wasn't worth it to go to the polls for someone they felt had abandoned them. Years later, I saw this on the 2012 Iowa caucus campaign trail. Santorum was a frequent guest on my program, and every time he came on, I would receive calls, emails, and Facebook posts from conservatives who wanted me to ask him about his Specter endorsement. That endorsement was seen as such a betrayal that many conservatives treated Santorum as if he didn't have a record in the U.S. Senate that on several key issues would have been one of the most conservative of his era. It was like Santorum had become his middle name, and he was now known as Rick Santorum, who endorsed Arlen Specter. I know a couple of Iowa caucus activists that wouldn't agree to support Santorum until he looked them in the eye and promised he'd never endorse someone like Specter again. By the way, Santorum said one of the reasons he made a bargain with Specter to help him in his primary was because Specter promised to help shepherd President George W. Bush's judicial appointments through a testy nomination process. Specter was chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee at the time. One of those appointments Santorum wanted Specter's help with is now Chief Justice John Roberts, a man who did as much damage to the Constitution in 1 week in 2012 that most liberals can only hope to achieve in a lifetime. Roberts was the deciding vote in the U.S. Supreme Court, telling the sovereign state of Arizona it has no authority to enforce the U.S. Constitution, even though the sovereignty of the states precedes the Constitution, and the Constitution required ratification from the states to become law. That whole, government by the consent of the governed thing. Then Roberts was the deciding vote in telling the federal government it has unlimited jurisdiction into the lives of American citizens, provided it uses the 16th Amendment as the means to tread on us. Roberts was even willing to allow the federal government to tax us for what we're not doing, which is unprecedented in American history. By positing this, Roberts went so far as to restructure the mandate within Obamacare as a spoonful of sugar to help the bitter medicine go down. Now, if that's not legislating from the bench, I don't know what is. These two opinions by Roberts are not just unconstitutional, they are anti-constitutional. They clearly are anti both the spirit and explicit wording of the U.S. Constitution, which is intended to limit the jurisdiction of the federal government in order to maximize the freedom and liberty of the individual, as well as that of these United States of America. Fast forward to 2012, and Toomey returned the favor by endorsing Romney over Santorum in the Pennsylvania presidential primary. Much of the Republican infrastructure in that primary, still smarting from Santorum's Specter endorsement, also opposed Santorum and supported Romney. Faced with the prospect of a potential loss in his home state primary, Santorum dropped out rather than risk an embarrassing defeat that at worst would have ended his political career and at least would have undone a lot of the good he accomplished in his campaign up until that point. A good Catholic like Santorum will understand when I say Faustian bargains never pay off. Now, Santorum is not alone in having to learn that lesson. At the time this book was being written, Kentucky Senator Rand Paul was poised to inherit not just his father's revolution, but also expand it into the ranks of social conservatives who, like him, but were skeptical of his father's libertarian bent. However, Paul angered some of his father's longtime supporters when he endorsed Romney for president after his father suspended his bid. His father never did endorse Romney. And it wasn't just that Rand endorsed Romney, it was the way he did it. He heaped more praise on Romney on Fox News than liberal Republican Rudy Giuliani did. He even started repeating the same old talking points about having to work within the system. That's hardly the talk of revolution. Except people didn't join his father's revolution to work within the system. Revolutions want to topple systems. They joined his father's movement to drain the swamp. Paulistas correctly see the system as unsalvageable. They were hoping Rand would inherit his father's revolution, but smooth out his father's rough edges when it comes to presentation. This was not what they had in mind. One of the things Rand said in his defense at the time is the exact same flawed thinking that led the religious right down the primrose path for the past 30 years. As my last book, We Won't Get Fooled Again, Where the Christian Right Went Wrong and How to Make America Right Again, portrays in vivid detail. Rand said that he was close to getting a vote on auditing the Federal Reserve, something his father has advocated for years, and that the leadership of the Republican Party would be more willing to give him that vote if he supported the party's presidential nominee, unlike his father. But that, folks, is flat out wrong. In fact, the exact opposite is true. The only reason the Republican Party would be willing to provide Rand Paul a vote on auditing the Fed is because they're scared to death at what his father was able to accomplish in spite of them the past few years.
And that was part of Chapter 9 from Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again by Steve Deese. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, the daily laws for April the 6th.
April 6th. Seem dumber than your mark. Know how to make use of stupidity. The wisest man plays this card at times. There are occasions when the highest wisdom consists in appearing not to know. You must not be ignorant, but capable of playing it. Baltasar Gracian. If you are ambitious, yet find yourself low in the hierarchy, this trick can be useful. Appearing less intelligent than you are, even a bit of a fool, is the perfect disguise. Look like a harmless pig, and no one will believe you harbor dangerous ambitions. They may even promote you, since you seem so likable and subservient. Intelligence is the obvious quality to downplay, but why stop there? Taste and sophistication rank close to intelligence on the vanity scale. Make people feel they are more sophisticated than you are, and their guard will come down. An air of complete naivete can work wonders. Daily law. In general, always make people believe they are smarter and more sophisticated than you are. They will keep you around because you make them feel better about themselves, and the longer you are around, the more opportunities you will have to deceive them. The 48 Laws of Power, Law 21. Play a sucker to catch a sucker. Seem dumber than your mark.
And that was the Daily Law for April the 6th from the book The Daily Laws by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
Love God first, and then love everything and everybody else for the sake of God. That's the right ordering of our loves. What's the tendency of your will? Well, it has to be to God first and above all, and then everything else in light of that basic love. How's the Bible put it, by the way? Both Old Testament and New. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your soul, all your strength. And then Jesus adds, and the second commandment is like it, and love your neighbor as yourself. It's a basic principle. It might be the master principle of the whole Bible.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Quote, a mixed economy disintegrates a country into institutionalized civil war pressure groups, each fighting for legislative favors and special privileges at the expense of one another. Unquote. And that was the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Back in a minute. Thank you. If you are a Democrat, you should be voting Republican because the Republican Party is the true party of civil rights. It always has been. It was the party of civil rights in the Civil War, and right after the Civil War, it is the party that came up with the first three civil rights bills, all that were killed by Democrats, by the way. So it's the Republican Party that has always been about civil rights. So if you as a Democrat are interested in civil rights, you need to vote Republican and become a Republican. Back in a minute. Thank you. Facts are fine, but propaganda is power. Nobody cares about the facts. Yet, Republicans are bound and determined to pound a square peg into a round hole and force people to accept the facts. Propaganda is power because all democracies are fundamentally about popularity, and popularity has nothing to do with facts, and that's whether you're dealing with people or ideas. Republicans need to save the facts for courtrooms and embrace propaganda in order to win. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now we pick up where we left off with the 33 strategies of war.
Interpretation. For most of us, the conclusion of anything, a project, a campaign, an attempt at persuasion, represents a kind of wall. Our work is done, and it is time to tally our gains and losses and move on. Lyndon Johnson looked at the world much differently. An ending was not like a wall, but more like a door, leading to the next phase or battle. What mattered to him was not gaining a victory, but where it left him, how it opened onto the next round. What good would it do to win the election of 1937 if he were thrown out of office 18 months later? That would be a devastating setback to his dream of the presidency. If, after the election, he had basked in his moment of triumph, he would have sown the seeds of failure in the next election. He had made too many enemies. If they didn't run against him in 1938, they would stir up trouble while he was away in Washington. So Johnson immediately worked to win these men over, whether with charm, with meaningful gestures, or with clever appeals to their self-interest. He kept his eye on the future and on the kind of success that would keep him moving forward. Johnson used the same approach in his efforts to win over voters. Instead of trying to persuade people to support him with speeches and fancy words, he was not a good orator anyway, he focused on the feeling he left people with. He knew that persuasion is ultimately a process of the emotions. Words can sound nice, but if a politician leaves people suspecting him of being insincere, of merely plugging for votes, they will close off to him and forget him. So Johnson worked to establish an emotional connection with voters, and he would close his conversations with them with a hearty handshake and with a look in his eye, a tremor in his voice that sealed the bond between them. He left them feeling that they would see him again, and he stirred emotions that would erase any suspicion he might be insincere. The end of the conversation was in fact a kind of beginning, for it stayed in their minds and translated into votes. Understand, in any venture, your tendency to think in terms of winning or losing, success or failure, is dangerous. Your mind comes to a stop instead of looking ahead. Emotions dominate the moment. A smug elation in winning, dejection and bitterness in losing. What you need is a more fluid and strategic outlook on life. Nothing ever really ends. How you finish something will influence and even determine what you do next. Some victories are negative. They lead nowhere. And some defeats are positive, working as a wake-up call or lesson. This fluid kind of thinking will force you to put more strategic emphasis on the quality and mood of the ending. It will make you look at your opponents and decide whether you might do better to be generous to them at the end, taking a step back and transforming them into allies, playing on the emotions of the moment. Keeping your eyes on the aftermath of any encounter, you will think more of the feeling you leave people with, a feeling that might translate into a desire to see more of you. By understanding that any victory or defeat is temporary, and that what matters is what you do with them, you will find it easier to keep yourself balanced during the thousands of battles that life entails. The only real ending is death. Everything else is a transition. From Hagakure, the Book of the Samurai, by Yamamoto Tsunetomo. As Yasuda Ukyo said about offering up the last wine cup, only the end of things is important. One's whole life should be like this. When guests are leaving, the mood of being reluctant to say farewell is essential. Keys to warfare. There are three kinds of people in the world. First, there are the dreamers and talkers, who begin their projects with a burst of enthusiasm, but this burst of energy quickly peters out as they encounter the real world and the hard work needed to bring any project to an end. They are emotional creatures who live mainly in the moment. They easily lose interest as something new grabs their attention. Their lives are littered with half-finished projects, including some that barely make it beyond a daydream. Then there are those who bring whatever they do to a conclusion, either because they have to or because they can manage the effort. But they cross the finish line with distinctly less enthusiasm and energy than they had starting out. This mars the end of the campaign. Because they are impatient to finish, the ending seems hurried and patched together, and it leaves other people feeling slightly unsatisfied. It is not memorable, does not last, has no resonance. Both of these types begin each project without a firm idea of how to end it. And as the project progresses, inevitably differing from what they had imagined it would be, they become unsure how to get out of it, and either give up or simply rush to the end. The third group comprises those who understand a primary law of power and strategy. The end of something, a project, a campaign, a conversation, has inordinate importance for people. It resonates in the mind. A war can begin with great fanfare and can bring many victories, but if it ends badly, that is all anyone remembers. Knowing the importance and the emotional resonance of the ending of anything, people of the third type understand that the issue is not simply finishing what they have started, but finishing it well, with energy, a clear head, and an eye on the afterglow, the way the event will linger in people's minds. These types invariably begin with a clear plan. When setbacks come, as setbacks will, they are able to stay patient and think rationally. They plan not just to the end, but past it, to the aftermath. These are the ones who create things that last. A meaningful piece, a memorable work of art, a long and fruitful career.
And that was the next part of chapter 22, Know How to End Things, from the 33 Strategies of War. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now we pick up where we left off with the enemies of my country.
50. Worthy sat in his car, alone in the darkness, stretching his legs so they wouldn't fall asleep. He'd been there for close to 8 hours, peeing in bottles and trying to stay awake as his vision blurred and he yawned repeatedly. Giving his face a slap to restore some alertness, he refocused his gaze on the factory through the trees beyond his windshield. He'd initially been apprehensive about someone knocking on his window, asking what in the hell he was doing there. Or worse yet, a patrol officer being called in by a neighboring business that had reported a suspicious vehicle with a single occupant remaining behind the wheel for hours on end. He'd dreamed up a few cover stories tailored to whoever discovered him there. He'd certainly had time to do so, all the way up to verbally rehearsing them to himself. But after the sun set without the slightest whisper of movement around him, it became apparent that the industrial park was a ghost town. And why wouldn't it be? Tomorrow was the 4th of July. Actually, today was, since his watch had crossed the stroke of midnight just over 2 hours earlier, and any business not owned by a complete and total communist would have closed early to allow their employees a head start on travel plans for the holiday weekend. So Worthy had sat, and sat, and sat some more, watching the metalworking factory with no more action than the security lights ticking on automatically before sunset. This kind of assignment would have been fine for someone like Cancer, a trained sniper used to observing the world through a scope for hours on end. But Worthy wasn't a sniper. His specialty was running and gunning with blazing speed, reflexes honed for a split-second response. The wait would have been bearable, given the knowledge that he'd soon be slipping inside the building, joining his team for the intelligence collection ahead. That wasn't, however, going to be the case. David had sounded almost apologetic when he'd handed Worthy his marching orders. Sorry, but we'll need you to stay on lookout duty. It wasn't even a matter of monitoring the police scanner, which they'd be able to do as well as he could. The simple fact was they suspected this facility of being owned by some very bad people, and those people wouldn't necessarily call the cops if they became aware of unwelcome visitors. Worthy doubted the building even had an active, normal security system. That would put the police on automatic response in the event of a break-in, complete with carte blanche to make entry if they found a door or window ajar. No, Worthy suspected the reality was much worse. They probably had a silent alarm of some kind, complete with their own personal response force designated to appear on command, intent on ensuring that anyone who penetrated their lion's den didn't live to tell about what they'd found inside. That would hold doubly true if the rockets were present, a possibility that Worthy discounted based on the simple fact that they hadn't seen any sign of personnel since arriving. Ian was aware of that too, which explained why he'd spent several hours making provisions to set up a cable relay in a nearby electrical junction box, ensuring that any security systems reliant on building outlets would detect a steady stream of electricity and not switch to their internal power supply. This would, in theory, prevent the alarm from being raised even if the entry team tripped a sensor. As far as the electronics were concerned, all circuits would appear complete and unbroken, and the team could take their time sifting for intelligence within the main offices. It was far from a failsafe, however. There could be any number of security measures running off an internal power supply in the first place, necessitating the entry team to carry cellular and wireless jammers on their kit. But they'd have no way of knowing whether that effort was successful or not until one of two things occurred. They slipped out of the building upon mission completion, or the effort was cut short by some outside response, law enforcement or otherwise. So Worthy's duties as team lookout were far from over. He just hoped that the team's entry into the building was as uneventful as his surveillance had been. Otherwise, things were going to get very interesting very quickly. David's voice came over his earpiece then. Angel is relay complete, David said. Team 1 is moving to make entry. Riley rose from his crouch at the string of trees lining the factory and darted across the open ground toward the building. The single-story row of offices was phosphorescent green in his night vision, backed by the 2-floor warehouse attachment behind it. Cancer shadowed his movement by a few paces, his voice in Riley's earpiece broadcasting their intent. Team 2 copies. We're on the move. Riley approached the side of the building, slowing as he reached the window designated as their point of entry. He prepared to breach the building's exterior, completely dependent on Cancer to provide cover. As much as he hated to concede that Cancer's plan was a good one, there was good reason for splitting the entry team into two-man elements. While only Ian had the equipment and training to pilfer digital evidence from any computers they found, Riley and Cancer provided another intangible benefit: security. Granted, Worthy hadn't seen any activity or even lit windows, but that didn't mean the building was empty. With David providing immediate security for Ian, Cancer and Riley could begin sweeping the building for any human presence. And while David had been adamant that any personnel found inside should be restrained uninjured, if they were affiliated with terrorists, they'd need to be interrogated, and if not, there was no need to harm helpless civilians. Riley was concerned about his partner's degree of restraint, or lack thereof. The bottom line was that Cancer liked killing people, plain and simple. If Riley was the team's moral compass, then Cancer was like an iron ore deposit that would swing the needle askew at the first possible opportunity. Riley saw the team's mission as a force for good, and he'd clashed with Cancer on this issue at every conceivable juncture. In that regard, David had been right to pair him with the team's second-in-command. None of that mattered tonight, of course, until they made it into the building. With the security systems disabled, hopefully, at least, by Ian's bypass on the junction box, Riley had no choice but to trust the cellular and wireless jammer in his assault pack as he employed his Halligan bar in the window. More commonly known as the Hooley tool, the iron bar had a giant forked chisel on one end and a wedge with a perpendicular pick on the other. Most law enforcement and firefighter applications, even military, employed the break and rake technique of smashing a window, then scraping the broken glass from the frame for follow-on personnel to enter. But nothing so overt would suit their purposes tonight, and instead Riley wedged the chiseled end into the frame, prying the sliding window upward with a sharp crack of the surrounding molding. Cancer whispered, "Can you get any louder, asshole?" Ignoring him, Riley used a gloved hand to push the window up and out of the way, dropping to all fours for Cancer to step on his back, which he did a little more harshly than necessary to enter through the window frame. Grunting under the footfall, Riley felt Cancer's weight vanish. Rising quickly, he adjusted the Hooley bar on its sling and placed both hands on the open frame, then leapt through the window and into the building. Ian stepped inside the building, pulling the windows shut behind him as directed before turning to scan through his night vision. David was a black shadow in the hallway, sweeping his weapon across a green swath of the building interior as he cleared for immediate threats. Wasting no time, Ian tested the handle of the office door to his right, found it unlocked, and quickly cleared it. The process was clumsy, and not just because Ian lacked his teammates' tactical experience. There was also the matter of his weapon, a Colt 1911 handgun from Riley's personal collection. The family heirloom was passed down from his grandfather, and he'd entrusted it to the team's intelligence operative not as a sign of respect, but rather because Ian was the least likely to fire a shot. The .45 caliber pistol felt alien in his hands, and he desperately wanted to use the agency-issued rifle slung on his back as a last resort. It didn't matter anyway, he thought. The office was empty, a pair of computer workstations facing the wall and window. Ian holstered his pistol and moved toward the computers, finding the small box-like device secured in his cargo pocket and plugging it into a USB port. A flashing red light blinked at a corner of the device, indicating that it was in the process of copying the hard drive. At that moment, Ian wasn't concerned whether the launch assembly was present in the facility. If so, Riley and Cancer would uncover it in minutes, and the team would exfil and overwatch the building until police responded to their anonymous tip. And if any terrorists showed to secure their cargo before then, well, Ian's team would get a chance to put Riley's weapons to good use. Barring that possibility, and Ian guessed from the building's lack of guard personnel that the odds were slim indeed, anything of value from tonight's raid would come from the hard drives. When the light on his device turned from blinking red to steady green, he pulled the USB cord and hastily moved to the second computer. Riley followed Cancer into the warehouse portion of the facility, seeing a 2-story high ceiling packed to capacity with giant machines, welding equipment, and parked forklifts. As Cancer flowed left, Riley proceeded toward a row of tall shelving in the opposite direction and tucked his body behind a stack of empty pallets. He saw a large sign on the wall proclaiming the original name of the business, Dominion Metal Fab, and briefly wondered if there was cause for suspicion in the new owners not immediately changing all branding to their own title. No time to consider it, though. He was on a hunt first for any enemy in the facility, followed by any trace of the rockets, and he continued moving forward down the long axis of the warehouse, sweeping his barrel left and right to search for threats. Then he heard a noise to his front. It was immediately more terrifying than footsteps or even a gunshot, both of which might have at least come from his teammates. But what he heard was someone calling out, "Jesse?" He spun to the side and angled his rifle up, but it was too late. He was in the glare of a flashlight held by a man stepping out from behind a machine in the workshop, and Riley's night vision flared to a blinding shade of white-green. Squinting through the glare, Riley desperately tried to determine if the man held a weapon in his opposite hand. He was unable to tell before another figure appeared, this one a shadow closing with the first man and driving his fist into his exposed side. It was Cancer, and Riley didn't need to register the choking gasp to know that his teammate had just plunged a blade into the man's kidney. The effect was devastating. A stab to the kidney caused such crippling pain that the victim was rendered incapable of crying out, and the man fell to his knees as the flashlight clattered and rolled sideways. Riley's night vision focused on the view of Cancer finishing the job, thrusting his blade into the side of the man's neck and ripping out the front before flinging the body downward. There was a wet, suctioning noise as the man gasped his last dying breaths without so much as a scream, and Riley raced forward amid an exploding sense of dread and horror. Even as he moved toward the casualty, he knew he'd be too late. There was no treatment Riley could administer that would delay this man's death, even if he'd had a full complement of medical supplies on hand. "Jesus," he whispered as he stopped before the body. "What have you done?" Cancer said, "Relax. Not a lot of security guards packing MAC-10s. Riley glanced down to see the submachine gun lying on a sling at the man's side. When Riley didn't respond, Cancer said, "You're welcome." Then he patted down the man's pockets, removing a cell phone and sliding it into a drop pouch as he transmitted, "Tango down, 1 EKIA in the warehouse." Ian heard David's whispered response over his earpiece. "Copy, Tango down. Any sign of the rockets or launch assembly?" "Negative," Cancer replied. "Continuing clearance." Pulling the USB cord from the second computer, Ian secured the cloning device in his pocket and moved out of the office with his senses aflame. Cancer had just transmitted a confirmed enemy kill in the warehouse, though David didn't seem to mind at all. Instead, at the sight of Ian, he advanced further, entering an office as Ian pulled security down the corridor, waiting for David to reappear with the signal that everything was okay. He did so a moment later, taking up a security position with his shoulder flush against a doorway to the left, his rifle aimed down the hall as his body remained behind cover. Ian rushed inside to assess the contents of the office. There was only a single workstation here, and he moved to clone the hard drive as he considered the implications of a team kill on domestic soil. At present, the magnitude of that particular event seemed lost to everyone but him. Duchess would find out about this. How could she not? Surely she was casting an analytical eye to the goings-on in Charlottesville, particularly after she'd seen fit to personally follow and confront David in his hometown. And when that happened, she'd have them all carted off to a black site in the time it took them to realize what was happening. The light on his device flared to a steady green, and he detached the USB cord. With the third hard drive copied, Ian moved back to the door. He squeezed David's shoulder, and his team leader moved forward once again, cutting into the next office as Ian covered down the hallway and waited for him to reemerge. Once again, David did, though this time under less voluntary circumstances. He was flung against the far wall against the weight of a silverback of a man who pummeled him in a half-tackle. A single unsuppressed gunshot sounded from David's barrel, the flash of light momentarily illuminating the hallway before everything went dark again. As Ian oriented himself through his night vision, he heard Cancer transmit over the net, "Status," before focusing on the dark mass of two bodies on the floor. The distinction between where the giant's body ended and David's began impossible to tell at this distance. Ian reacted instinctively, 100 shooting range lessons imparted from his teammates congealing into a single reflexive action that he performed with astonishing quickness. Launching forward a step, he fell to his knees and slid forward, angling his handgun upward for a shot that would send the bullet through the attacker's head and into the ceiling without injuring his team leader in the slightest. The maneuver played out with impossible perfection, the 1911 sights aligning with his opponent's block-like head in the time it took him to flick off the thumb safety. But before he could squeeze the trigger, the giant's fist sailed out of the darkness, cracking against the side of Ian's head and flipping his night vision device sideways. He fell backward, involuntarily firing a second round into the wall, the ricochet sending the bullet careening down the hallway as Ian's head exploded into ringing flashes of color. Cancer moved at a sprint with Riley at his rear, both racing to back up their teammates by the time the second shot fired. Worthy transmitted, "Do you need support? Stand by," Cancer replied, slowing as he approached the doorway leading into the office hallway. The doorway was open, lacking even a closable panel, and Cancer stopped in front of it before stepping sideways to clear the space beyond. Once he'd come parallel with the opposite wall, he dropped his barrel as Riley cut past him into the hallway, and Cancer moved forward to clear in the opposite direction. Seeing an empty corridor, he spun in place to view the scene before him, Ian on the ground, David being choked to death by a monstrous figure, and Riley standing motionless, momentarily stunned. "What are you waiting for?" Cancer asked. "Hit him!" It was easy for Cancer to say, and he knew it. Riley was the biggest guy on the team by a long shot, and he looked like a child beside this hulking monster trying to choke the life out of their team leader. The man was an absolute beast, and he was too close to David for anyone to risk firing a shot. Undaunted, Riley flung his massive body atop the figure, trying to choke the man before being flung sideways, his huli tool flying off his side upon impact and clattering against the floor. Shaking his head, Cancer slung his weapon and drew his fighting knife for the second time in the space of 3 minutes. He knelt beside the mass of human bodies before him, driving his blade into the stomach of the barbarian currently manhandling his teammates with savage ferocity. The giant was unfazed by the effort, knocking Cancer backward as he spun sideways with Riley atop his back. No matter, he thought. The knife was still firmly within his grasp. What most people didn't know about knife kills, save the police who investigated the aftermath, was that the blade frequently lodged on bone, causing the attacker's hand to slide onto the exposed blade and leave a smattering of DNA residue in the form of blood. It was for this reason that Cancer used a fighting knife with a hilt, ensuring that his stabs left him uncut. He delivered another 2 blows to the man's belly, knowing that they would cause an astonishing amount of pain while leaving the man to die a slow, agonizing death with plenty of time left over for tactical questioning. But the immense man was fighting his way to a standing position, struggling mightily against the best efforts of 3 men trying to stop him. Ian was still semi-motionless on the floor, struggling to regain his senses. Cancer was pushing himself to his feet in preparation for the next attack when a 6th figure appeared. A moment's analysis proved it to be Worthy, summoned either by the audible gunshots or the sporadic radio transmissions that had continued without resolution, and Cancer saw him pick up Riley's huli tool from its resting place on the ground. Bracing his feet for the effort, Worthy raised the chiseled end over his head and brought it down with a sickening thump atop the man's head. The giant figure jolted violently and then dropped to the floor like a stone, David and Riley collapsing atop him in a pile of human bodies. Sheathing his bloodied knife, Cancer knelt, feeling for a pulse through his gloved fingertips, and then looking up at the murderer before him. "Why'd you have to kill him? Can't get information from a dead body." Worthy was panting for breath, holding his huli tool like a fireman with an axe. "I couldn't. He was... Oh, shit." David rose from the ground, giving Worthy a pat on his shoulder. "It's all right, buddy. You don't know your own strength. Thanks for the save." Before anyone could respond, they heard the shrill wail of police sirens, as loud and piercing as if they were inside the building. David called out, "You guys are on your own. Get that intel back to the team house. Find out where BK is headed." And then David was gone, sprinting toward the warehouse in what seemed to be a determined attempt for suicide by cop. Without alternatives to intervene, the team scattered out of the building and raced toward their vehicles. I burst into the warehouse facility, momentarily overwhelmed by the sight before me, shelving in equipment, machines, and forklifts as far as the eye could see, before focusing my night vision on a dark panel of doorway to the front of the building. This was stupid, I realized, even as I completed the action. But as with every time that thought had occurred to me, I proceeded nonetheless, charging through the door's push bar into the outdoors. With team vehicles parked to the north, east, and south, there was only one direction I could move to direct police attention away from my team as they escaped the facility: west, directly out the front door. I did so at a run, emerging outside to the swirling red and blue lights of multiple police cruisers and the sounds of men shouting, "Police, stay where you are!" Both statements seemed redundant given the circumstances, and I cut left to break into a dead sprint along the front of the building toward the far tree line. This was pitting my speed against police marksmanship, pure and simple. The odds of me falling in a hail of gunfire were too high for this to make any rational sense whatsoever. But the cops didn't shoot, instead relocating to give chase, as evidenced by the sound of car doors slamming and engines revving from the main parking lot. Then came running footfalls and shouted commands behind me as an unknown number of officers pursued me on foot. It was hard to tell which side held an advantage in physical fitness, and we both certainly had adrenaline on our side. However, I had one thing going for me over the members of law enforcement currently chasing after a shadowy figure in the night. They were, as a rule, consummate professionals, dedicated to public safety and their own duty. I, by contrast, was a reckless amateur, and reckless amateurs got lucky. My thought process was questionable, but in my mind there seemed to be no other way. If I hadn't distracted the police, they would have quickly surrounded the building and captured one or more of my teammates. And while I didn't doubt my colleagues' ability to serve time in jail, they'd been to arguably worse destinations around the world, with Syria a prime candidate among them, there was a larger consideration at play. In providing security for Ian, I definitively knew that I had no discernible intelligence that would stop Barry Khan's attempt at, well, whatever it was he was attempting. Now that Monticello had been ruled out, the sky was the limit for a well-equipped terrorist like him. But I couldn't say the same for any of my teammates. Not Ian, who carried an assault pack full of data from cloned hard drives, nor Riley and Cancer, who had seen the bowels of the warehouse and could have a clue that possessed the missing link we sought. If any of them were rolled up by the cops, then Barry Khan could very feasibly succeed in slaughtering hundreds of our countrymen in the time it took for the captured member to explain their situation, probably without much assistance from Duchess, who had her own legal and political justifications to consider. I ran west, armed with a basic orientation of my surroundings from analysis of overhead imagery. In the industrial park, I was a sitting duck. The paved expanses and large parking lots lent themselves to easy police vehicle access, to say nothing of the fact that I had 4 team members who needed to slip out of there as discreetly as possible. My shadow was cast as a long and distorted phantom before me, the police flashlights lighting my back as I took surging breaths like a sprinter on the 100-yard dash. Which, for the moment, I was. A short stretch of woods was visible to my front, and I desperately needed to reach it. For one, it would provide concealment to block cops' view, allowing me to disappear if only for a short time. And second, I desperately needed a reprieve from the all-out sprint that was setting my muscles and lungs aflame. Plunging into the trees, I transitioned from a straight-line sprint to an erratic, zigzagging course to dodge the trees. Grateful for the necessary reduction in speed, I relied on the swirling glow of police flashlights casting nightmarish shadows through the branches as I moved. I emerged into an open stretch, landing a single step on a paved walking trail before launching through the trees beyond, pumping my legs up a steep incline that made my hamstrings and calves cramp with effort. Then I was over the top and descending, scrambling down the wooded embankment. I lost my footing, tumbling sideways through brambles and leaf litter before rolling into the open. Struggling to my feet, I found myself on a short expanse of grass between houses. I'd made it into the neighborhood beside the industrial park, a critical step in my escape. Next, I'd have to cross the subdivision, a process that began with launching into a run onto the paved cul-de-sac before me. Racing down the street with a row of houses on either side, I entered a surreal suburban reality, risking the exposure of streetlights for the sake of gaining distance from my pursuers. My lungs were screaming for air, legs on the tremulous brink of giving out as I exploited every milligram of adrenaline in my system. Closing with the main road, I caught a glimpse of a street sign, Running Fox Lane, and thought how appropriate to my current situation. The only thing my hunters were missing at present were the dogs to follow my scent, and those were surely on the way. And while I could temporarily outpace the officers currently swarming into the neighborhood, my running abilities wouldn't count for much the second a 70-pound German Shepherd was let off the leash. I dashed across the street, seeing the red flickers of a patrol car screaming toward me from the left. They'd moved to surround me with astonishing speed, reacting to my direction of movement and trying to cut me off at every possible junction. Now that I'd been spotted, their search radius was immediately narrowed to a single point in the neighborhood, and as I reached the far side of the street, I cut left between houses, feet pounding across a manicured lawn as the patrol car followed my progress. I cut right, tucking myself behind the backside of a house as a blazing white spotlight illuminated the space I'd just departed. Then I continued moving west toward the final yard separating me from a large span of woods bordering I-64 to the south. At present, I was merely an armed suspect in a B&E, but once the first officers searched the metalworking factory, that would immediately escalate to murder, and my odds of getting shot would rise by a factor of 10. As I made it to the woods and began racing uphill, I took a fleeting glance behind me. The night sky above the housetops was lit by the ethereal blue and red glow of flashing police lights, the barking of every dog in the neighborhood punctuated by the slamming of car doors and shouts of officers. This entire raid had turned into a disaster in record time, and for a moment I wondered if my team had made it out of the industrial park undetected. No time to consider it now. I turned and continued moving uphill, staying on a westerly course. When the canine units arrived, they'd hopefully suspect I was proceeding to the next neighborhood or north toward I-64. After 100 meters, I cut left instead, then turned south to follow the woods that presented multiple link-up points on the roads adjoining either side. I pushed onward, struggling to cover ground and fighting the overwhelming impulse to stop and rest. Everything hit me at once then. The failed attempts to kill Bari Khan, the moment we'd lost the rockets in Syria, the state of my relationship with Layla and Langley. I didn't know where this would end or what the ultimate outcome of my actions would be, not as it related to my imprisonment or death, and definitely not as it pertained to the family I'd set out to protect. The only certainty in that moment was that I needed to run, and so I did. I was a desperate fugitive, and the only recourse was to continue fleeing deeper into the woods, changing direction on a course that would lead miles into the night before I could call upon my team for help. Above it all was a sense of total exhaustion, mental, physical, and emotional, that I fought to suppress. And as I moved, the branches and thorn bushes whipping across my body in the black surroundings, I felt the sting of hot tears against my eyes.
And that was Chapter 50 of The Enemies of My Country by Jason Casper. Next week, Chapter 51. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there and reminding you that you are not neutral and that the government has no rights.